Hello, I'm Alice Hutchinson, the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I'm honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, puts it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So with that, I welcome you. And please join us every Monday evening at this time as many of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other and with you in an effort to bring us together. So if you missed our program last week with Helen Vendler and Lloyd Schwartz or any of the previous episodes of Write America, you can go to Birds Books Crowdcast channel and watch the recordings at any time. Tonight's episode is also being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch. Tonight, Birds Books hosts Reading By and conversation with Edward Zwick and Patricia McCormick. I will return at the end after the readings and discussion to bring your questions and comments to the authors. For those of you unfamiliar with Crowdcast, I think many of you have already discovered the chat to the right of your screen. Please feel free to comment throughout the evening. But if you have a question, at the bottom of the page, you will see Ask a Question. There's a tab. Go there and type your question, and I'll go there to look. Third thing, there's a green tab at the bottom of your screen that's a link to this episode on the Birds Books website where you can purchase the author's books while supporting the bookstore and Write America. Now, we're having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to see if Patricia McCormick can get onto the screen and start. If not, we'll start with Ed. So let's just see if this works. You're just going to be part of my experiment here. So we'll go ahead and start with Ed, and then if we can get Patty onto the screen, it'll be great. Our first speaker is Edward Zwick. Edward Zwick is an American filmmaker and producer of film and television. He has worked primarily in the comedy, drama, and epic historical film genres, including About Last Night, Glory, Legends of the Fall, and The Last Samurai. He is also the co-creator of the television series 30-something and Once and Again. Zwick's body of work has earned numerous accolades, including an Academy Award and BAFTA Award for Best Picture as a producer, and Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Drama Series, Outstanding Writing in a Limited Series, and Outstanding Dramatic Special. He has additionally been nominated for multiple Golden Globe Awards. Please welcome to the screen, Edward Zwick. So let me find you here, Ed, and get you. There you go.
There I am. Hi, Alice. So the piece that I'm going to read this evening is called The Uncles. I think it's self-explanatory. The Uncles. My grandfather, Ichki, was a tough Jew. I am named after him.
You've accepted.
I'm sorry? Alice?
Tap to unmute just to see.
I'm hearing someone on there. Let's start
It's
again.
okay. Please do.
Okay. My grandfather, Ichki, was a tough Jew. I am named after him. My Hebrew name is Yitzhak. In 1920s Chicago, his 5 brothers, the Uncles as they were known, Dovey, Fat, Zeus, Zell, and Jules, were betting commissioners, a polite word for bookie, for the Capone mob. As a boy, I secretly relished my family's unsavory past. I had conventional heroes too. Like my non-Jewish schoolmates, I thrilled to JFK, profiles in courage, the NASA astronauts, and the leatherneck Marines of Guadalcanal. But other tales marked my childhood. Stories whispered when the grown-ups believed me out of earshot. Accounts of lost relatives in places with unpronounceable names. accompanied by tears and sighs. Eventually, I came to know the grainy out-of-focus images of hollow-eyed survivors in striped pajamas or corpses piled high in open pits. I saw the documentaries with living skeletons clinging to barbed wire. This grisly iconography of passivity and victimization became not only a morbid obsession, but also a source of shame. And so when a friend sent me Nechama Tech's book called Defiance and suggested we write a screenplay, I groaned, not another Holocaust movie. But the story of the Bielski brothers, who fought the Nazis in the forests of Belarus and saved 1,200 lives, was unlike anything I'd ever read about at that time. Instead of helplessness and submission, here was rage and resistance, warriors. I knew about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, yet it seemed to stand alone in the popular imagination as the only moment in which opposition took hold. Learning of their defiant acts awakened in me something primitive and deeply personal, a wave of awe and humility, and outrage too. Why hadn't I known these stories? Those of us who make movies are always searching for heroes. More often than not, they're imaginary. Luke Skywalker battles the Galactic Empire. Frodo Baggins duels with the Dark Lord. We have Spider-Man and Batman and Iron Man, but few ordinary men. Because the closer one looks at real-life heroes, the less they conform to the simple verities Hollywood finds easiest to peddle. Of the Bielskis, it was said they were like blocks of wood. Miller's sons raised in the woods, uneducated, casually violent, sexually predacious, at times murderous, at times merciful. They were the least likely of leaders. Yet these flawed men confronted daunting moral decisions, whether to seek vengeance or to rescue others, how to recreate a community among those who had lost everything, how to keep faith alive when all evidence was that God had turned away. And gradually, reluctantly even, they rose to the task, discovering in themselves something extraordinary. Arriving on set at dawn for the first day of filming, I encountered something amazing. Hundreds of spectral figures, extras in tattered rags with blankets wrapped around their heads, huddled together in the dripping forest, like ghosts of those who had lived and died on this very ground. It suggested we were not only presuming to honor the dead, but conjuring forth their spirits. To work at northern latitudes is to be always mindful of winter's approach. By September, there was frost on the ground. By mid-October, we were knee-deep in snow. By November, the pale sun was gone by 3. Despite our sophisticated outerwear, we were always cold. Yet, for 3 long winters in sub-zero temperatures and the same mind-numbing wind off the Baltic that brought Hitler's assault on Russia to a frostbitten halt, these people wrapped themselves in skins and rags, braved starvation, and dug burrows into hillsides, living like moles. If a director's job can be said to be verisimilitude, it was as if my work was being held by an unseen hand. There was no need to instruct the actors to shiver. They were shivering for real. Nor did I need Stanislavski to communicate a motivation as simple as survival. Whether an actor was dealing a trench or peeling a potato with frozen fingers, the story was telling itself. Sometimes I would look through the camera and drift off because I was projecting myself into the scene I was filming. As I imagined myself rooting in the frozen ground with a sharpened spoon or sanding sentry in the icy twilight, I couldn't help but ask myself, how would I have fared in the forest? Would I have dared go into the forest at all? It felt as if some private boundary had been reached. The faces of the local extras looked like my face. Their bodies were shaped like my body. Even their Eastern European inflections sounded familiar, and when the grown sons of the Bielskis visited the set, laughing and crying while telling stories about their parents, These loud, funny, warm, rough men were utterly recognizable. They reminded me of my uncles. One night, as I waited in the ankle-deep snow for a lighting setup, I realized how much my time in the forest was affecting me. In literature, the forest has always been a place of transformation. The lost children in Grimm's fairy tales were the characters in Twelfth Night. And now it was changing me too. Was this, I wondered, why I had written this movie? The truth is, a filmmaker's motivations often can't be understood until years after the fact, if indeed they can ever be understood. During my time in Hollywood, I banged heads with more than a few hard-nosed Jews. I've worked with Samuel Z. Arkoff and Ray Stark, and yes, with Harvey Weinstein. And while they like to talk like gangsters, I can't say I ever feared for my life. I was born 2 generations removed from the Holocaust, and the odds of my fighting back, had I been there, are overwhelmingly against it. Yet I've come to understand that resistance has many faces and continues long after the fighting has stopped. Perhaps making this film was my way. As December blew into Lithuania, the forest became a fortress of snow, as impregnable to filmmaking as it was to enemy assault 70 years ago. It was time to go home. On the first day of shooting, I had pasted into the inside cover of my script the fading daguerreotypes taken at Ellis Island that accompanied my uncle's applications for citizenship. Staring at them in the frozen night, I couldn't help but feel they had been with me all along, and that I had made this film to affirm the connection between my safe, sweet, assimilated life and the lives of those hardened, proud heroes of my childhood. And as they had done for so many others, the Bielskis had led me home. Alice?
I am here. And what I'm going to do is I will go ahead and minimize you now and try and see if we can get Patricia on screen. And if we can't, then you and I are going to have a chat. So Patricia, let's see where you are. I'm inviting you on screen now. And thank you, Ed. That really was superb. Helma was right. I am going to prompt you to come back. Nope. Can you invite Patricia through my address? I don't even know what that means. She is out with you guys in the audience, and we're trying to bring her on screen, and that's just doesn't seem to be working. So for now, I think what we're going to do is invite Ed back on. I understand. Well, here, I'll ask him.
Okay.
I'm sorry that didn't work. We tech tested and everything, but I'm just going to try again throughout the hour.
Sure.
Rumor has it you're working on a book?
Oh, I'd like not to say that it's a book so as to not put too much pressure on myself, but yes, it
you're
is.
Just writing. You're just writing.
I'm writing, without a goal or object that we may someday be a book. Yes.
Is there a possibility we can entice you to read some of it?
That would be really scary, but sure, I'm happy to do that.
All right. So when you finish, just say thank you, and then I'll come back on and ask some more questions.
Okay, wait a second. I have to see if I can find the book on my computer.
Okay, why don't you find it, and let me remind everybody in the audience that if you have a question, go to ask a question at the bottom of the screen, so that, because I can't track the chat for questions.
Remind them, or you'll remind me you just did.
Okay, that's awesome.
All right. Well, this the book will be not unlike the essay that I wrote, in which I've taken some of my films and used them as a prompt to write about subjects that are in and around those films. It's the first time I've written autobiographically in that regard. This is a piece that I've just finished writing, and I won't be able to read all of it. It's quite long. It's called In Search of Glory. Glory is a movie I made a number of years ago, maybe as much as 30 years ago. But I'll begin, and I'll just take it as far as it seems appropriate until Alice interrupts me. Maybe we can get hold of Patty. A project entitled Lay This Laurel had been in development at TriStar Pictures for 2 years. A first draft of the screenplay by Kevin Jarre, a young writer whose only credit had been the story of Sylvester Stallone's Rambo, was being peddled around town by the fabled aged-turned-producer Freddie Fields. Freddie was 66 at the time, a loving scoundrel with a twinkle in his eye, a passion for the business, and a reputation for being fast and loose with the facts. Freddie had produced several movies, but was best known for having represented such superstars as Paul Newman, Robert Redford, and Barbra Streisand. He is often referred to as the first Uber agent and had once represented Judy Garland, for whom he'd carried tourniquets in the trunk of his car for her many suicide attempts. Freddie had come across a slim volume entitled Lay This Laurel, a monograph by Lincoln Kirsten, describing the role of the 54th Massachusetts in the failed assault on Fort Wagner on July 18, 1863 in South Carolina. Kirsten, a major figure in American cultural history, not the least as the impresario for George Balanchine in the New York City Ballet, was a distant relative of Robert Gould Shaw, the regiment's 24-year-old commander. As a young boy growing up, as did Shaw in Beacon Hill, the wellspring of American abolitionism, Kirsten had thrilled to accounts of the Black Regiment's coverage of its courage. At that time, the story was so beloved as to be taught in Boston schools. There was even a junior high school named after William C. Carney, the first Black recipient to receive the Medal of Honor for valor during the attack. Though seriously wounded, Carney had crawled back to the Union lines carrying the regimental colors, a flag still displayed in the Boston State House. But history has a way of slipping in and out of fashion, especially when its commemoration is inconvenient to the social and political currents of the day. The busing riots of the 70s had torn Boston apart. Crowds of angry white men throwing stones at Black children on their way to school were incompatible with the idealized vision of the St. Gaudens's Monument on the Boston Common, a magnificent bas-relief of brave Black soldiers marching into battle on behalf of the Union. And as so happens with troublesome history, this remarkable chapter had faded into the historical shadows. As a college student in Boston, I'd often pass the statue with no more than the passing glance we tend to give obscure memorials to patriotic gore. I couldn't possibly have known that 15 years later, with the kind of kismet only Hollywood specializes in, I'd be given a chance to bring that statue to life. This extraordinary sequence of events began one September day in freshman American history class when I found myself sitting beside a friendly red-headed kid from Wellesley named Jeff Sagansky. It's possible we were both interested in the same girl, and I recall we once played tennis. We'd chat after class, greet each other as we passed in the quad, and eventually became the college friend you never really get to know, yet are always happy to see. After graduation, we lost track of each other. I'd heard he'd gone to business school, and so I was surprised to find him 10 years later in LA working in television. I shouldn't have been so surprised. A new breed of executive, many of them MBAs, were taking over Hollywood, and Jeff was in the vanguard. I was happy to see him. We started playing tennis again, and our casual friendship picked up where it left off. Our careers were both accelerating. I had made the TV show 30-something, and Jeff had risen rapidly in the executive ranks at NBC. My first movie, an adaptation of David Mamet's Sexual Perversity in Chicago, unfortunately retitled About Last Night, had done well enough that the financing studio, TriStar Pictures, asked me to make another. As I struggled to come up with something to do next, Jeff was named president of the studio. I'm going to skip ahead here because some of this is a little bit dense. I was sitting in my garden with my 2-year-old son at my feet when I read the little 48-page volume. Beautifully published, conformed remarkably to a classic dramatic shape without need to boulderize the facts or pump up the melodrama. But when I read Kevin Jarre's script, amid some wonderful writing, I saw a number of unexplored opportunities to better reveal the inner lives of the characters, the kind of moments that might give the movie a breath of life rather than the musty smell of textbook history. I'm going to skip ahead to something else which I really want to read, because if anybody's seen the movie, they'll know where I'm going. Let's see here. This is called Winging It. Here we go. All right. Wait. I'm coming is coming. All right. We had only been shooting for a few weeks when the time came to shoot the whipping scene. Denzel and I hadn't talked much about it. In fact, we hadn't talked much at all. Like the character he was playing, he remained very much apart from the rest of the cast and crew. It wouldn't be until later, after the movie was finished, that our friendship took root. On the morning we were to shoot the scene, I watched as the makeup department expertly applied keloid scars to his back, the cruel signature of whippings he had received before he ran away and came north. The prop department had fashioned a whip out of soft chamois. I asked them to show me what it felt like. It stung, just enough to let me know we were being hit. John Flynn was playing Sergeant Mulcahy, the man who would do the whipping, and he was anxious about the scene. He was a proud Irishman and knew the Irish had played a complex role in the Civil War. A bulwark of the Union Army's NCO Corps, in the same week of the regiment's Courage assault, there had been draft riots in New York City, fomented mostly by Irish thugs, in which hundreds of black men and women were killed. In fact, the vestiges of slavery could still be felt in Savannah, where we were shooting. No more than a mile from where we were to shoot the whipping scene, there were caves dug into slimy walls of the harbor, dungeons really, in which newly arrived slaves had been kept in chains until sold. It was upsetting to watch Denzel frog march, manacled hand and foot, onto the parade ground to the tattoo of the little drummer's snare. I had the grips lay enough dolly track to allow for a push-in on his face. It didn't take a directorial genius to know the money shot would be a big close-up. But the way a single tear came to be one of the iconic images of the movie, not to mention of Denzel's career, is as good an illustration of the silent collaboration between an actor and a director as any I've known. One thing I knew for sure, Denzel wouldn't want to do this shot more than a couple of times. Once we felt there was no wobble in the long tracking move or buzzed focus of his close-up, it would be time to shoot coverage. And after the most rudimentary rehearsal of Denzel's position, I called action. The scene went off without a hitch. The shirt was ripped off his back, revealing the scars. John stepped back, raised his arm, and brought down the whip once, twice, 3 times. Denzel reacted as I imagined he would, taking each lash stoically, denying as best he could any sign of what in real life would have been horrific pain. I gave a silent signal to the key grip that it was time to push in. The camera crept forward until it ended on a perfect close-up of Denzel's face, shining and beautiful in its defiance. His performance was very good. That was no surprise. I'm not sure there's ever been a single foot of film I've shot with Denzel that wasn't very good. But we did the shot anyway as a safety mostly. We were in for a long lens and the possibility for focus error was high. And this wasn't a scene anybody wanted to have to reshoot. At the end of the second take, the operator signaled that we were good. It would have been easy to move on to more reaction shots. But something told me there was more to be mined. I told Denzel we needed to adjust something at camera and that we would do the scene once more time. Then I took John Flynn aside and told him not to stop whipping until I said cut. He gave me a dark look, but nodded grimly. I walked back to the camera, made sure the dolly grip would again wait for my signal before pushing in. Wait, are you here? Patty? Okay. I walked back to the camera. I made sure the dolly grip would wait for my signal, and I called action. And just as he had done on previous takes, John ripped Denzel's shirt away and began to mete out the lashes. Once, twice, 3 times. In the prior takes, this would have been the moment for the camera to begin dollying in. But I waited. John raised the whip and brought it down again. 4 lashes, 5, 6. On earlier takes, Denzel had absolutely refused to acknowledge the pain and humiliation of the moment. He would take any moment that could be meted out. He would show nothing. He was in control. 7, 8. But now that control had been taken away, and there he stood helpless, the actor as well as the character, just as thousands of others had stood there before, abused, powerless, and alone. How long would this go on, he must have wondered. Without entirely understanding what I was doing, I had recreated the circumstances of 100 years before. By exerting my dominion over him, I was unconsciously shaming him. Was it manipulative? Was I manipulating his trust? Was he furious? Yes, to all, and yet not at all. Though I hadn't told Denzel my plan, I somehow knew he wouldn't break character. As immersed as he was in the moment, with the duality of consciousness reserved for only the greatest actors, he could feel it happening inside, even as he felt the camera drawing near, digging deeper. The shame and mortification were real now. It only made him fight harder, refusing to break. I stared at the monitor, watching him struggle. His face twitched. I signaled the dolly grip to push in. That a single tear appeared and slid down his face, catching the light at the perfect moment, is the magic of movies. But something else was happening at that moment, something that transcended the actors and directors, dollies and lenses. We had summoned ghosts. We all felt them among us. If you listen closely, you can hear Carrie Elwes sweeping off camera. After I called cut, I waited a moment before approaching Denzel. I put my arm on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off and moved away. Later that day, as we were shooting a scene with other actors, he stopped by the set wearing his Yankees baseball cap and joking with the crew. When I met his eye, he smiled. He knew what he had done. Much later, I asked how he'd prepared for the scene. I was alone in a little room waiting, he said, and I felt the spirit. So I said a prayer. Be with me.
Ed, thank you so much for sharing that. I apologize for the interruption. It was just the moment that we got Patty.
Good.
So
There you go.
we have her and we're ready to go. And so, no, thank you so much. I'm touched by that, as I'm sure everybody else was. Our next speaker is Patricia McCormick. And thank you all for your patience while we worked out our technological problems. Patricia McCormick is a 2-time National Book Award finalist and is the author of several critically acclaimed novels, including Never Fall Down, the true story of a boy who survived the killing fields of Cambodia by playing music for the Khmer Rouge, and Sold, a moving account of sexual trafficking. She is also the co-author of I Am Malala, the girl who was shot by the Taliban in her fight for education. Her books have been named to the New York Times Notable Books list, Publishers Weekly Best Books list, NPR's Best Books list, and iTunes Best Books list. Sold, featuring Gillian Anderson, was released as a feature film in April of 2016. Her book, The Plot to Kill Hitler, published in September 2016, was named a Publishers Weekly Top 10. Her first picture book, Sergeant Reckless, The True Story of a Little Horse Who Became a Hero, came out in the fall of 2017. Patricia's honors include the New York Foundation on the Arts Fellowship, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts Fellowship, and the McDowell Center Fellowship. Please welcome to the screen, Patricia McCormick. Yeah. Oh, you need to turn off your phone. You're signed in 2 places. That's what brings your echo.
First of all, I want to apologize.
You need to turn off that second connection because you're feeding back on it. And it's a little uncomfortable. No, you're signed in 2 places. So the other place needs to sign out. But that's the loop we're hearing. If it's the other computer in the same room, that'll do it. Are you ready? It's still echoing, ladies. So if you're on a phone that's signed in, or you're on another tab on your computer that's signed in, or if you're on a different computer that's signed in. Can you speak now? Let's see.
I hesitate to do it because it's going to echo.
So Whatever device you have that's signed in, other than this one, needs to go away now. So we can do, is there a second tab up top? We really want to hear you read.
There's not another tab.
Is your phone signed in? Is the other computer signed in from when you tried to get on here? Don't worry, folks. We'll keep going a little longer just to make sure that we get everybody. But thank you for your patience. Any luck? Any luck? You want to say something? You want to say something?
How is it, Alice? Is it okay?
Yes. Nope.
Oh,
Is it still echoing?
no,
Yes,
not
it's still an echo. Okay.
I think then we should probably
Well,
say goodnight. I can't fix this.
you might be able to. And
So
you're
patient.
not signed in the other computer. There has to be a way. There has to be a way. Is this computer signed in two places? Patty put headphones in. She can't, once you're signed into Crowdcast, you can't change all of that easily. So I'm not going to. Elliot, that's a great idea, but thank you.
There is people.
I can hear you without echoing.
You can hear it without the echo now?
Yes.
Okay.
Go.
Let's go. I apologize to all of you, in particular to Ed, my co-panelist. My piece is about trauma. This has been a trauma. All right, let me just take a breath here. Thanks for your patience. My youngest sister is angry with me. It started with a misunderstanding about my plans to take her son to the mall to buy Christmas presents. It ended with her throwing a box of chocolate-covered cherries at me from the open door of her car as she sped out of the parking lot. Let the record state, I was wrong. She was wrong. We were both wrong. The next day she posted an image on Facebook. Facebook, of course, is public, but when I opened my laptop and saw an image of an army sniper in full camo, his face obscured by black netting, his rifle cocked, I knew that this was a message aimed at me. Don't underestimate me, read the all caps caption. I know more than I say, think more than I speak, and notice more than you realize. I was safely back home by then in my apartment in New York, 3 hours away, but still, it unnerved me. That was more than 5 years ago. We haven't spoken since. Let the record state that I've emailed her several times, asked to talk, offered to meet in person, proposed seeing a therapist together, invited her to my daughter's wedding. She says she wants nothing to do with me. I tell myself, I don't understand what happened that day at the mall. That's true. I say I don't know what I did wrong. That's not totally true. I think I might. Still, my attention keeps being drawn back to her Facebook post and what she might have been trying to say. I try to imagine my sister searching the internet for just the image to convey her fury. I picture her late at night in her home, a ranch house near the central Pennsylvania suburban development where we grew up. A giant Notre Dame flag on the wall in the living room, our parents' old mahogany bed in her room. Her car with its personalized license plate parked in the driveway. Her 15-year-old son is asleep down the hall. At her feet are an assortment of cat dishes for her 3 cats. I can see her computer screen, the eerie white glow in the violet darkness of her home. Her finger hovers above the keyboard, and with one tap, she lobs a bit of pixelated artillery through the ether. It lands in my apartment, spraying shrapnel everywhere. What specifically I did that day at the mall, I called her out for making a mistake about the time and date of the shopping trip. I'd travel 3 hours for the occasion, which we'd planned weeks in advance. I told her she should apologize. I was patronizing, riding into town like Lady Bountiful to spread my riches at the Capital City Mall and return to my life in New York. Years before that, when I left home at 18 and she was 8, I deserted her with a volatile, sharp-tongued mother and a weak, unprotected father. And later, as an adult, I left her to care for her parents as they aged, and my mother's bitterness became a toxic gas that permeated the landscape. My sister was stuck in the trenches alone. But I don't think that's what I did to make her so angry. Back in the old days before I left for college, she and I had had a special bond. A chubby little tomboy with button eyes, Debbie was the youngest of the 4 girls in our family. I was the oldest. Our middle sisters, Liz and Amy, only 2 years apart, formed a pact almost automatically. That left the 2 of us, youngest and oldest, at either ends of the sister spectrum. When I was 13 and Debbie was 3, I decided to forge an alliance with her, spending my babysitting money on presents for her, creating scavenger hunts for her, sending her a stick of chewing gum in the mail. At age 4, she started calling me her buddy old pal. When we became adults, we kept up our buddy old pal partnership. She reached out to me when she wanted advice or was in trouble. Before there were cell phones, we once stayed on the phone for nearly 2 hours while she worked up the courage to leave an abusive boyfriend. He was asleep in the next room, and I stayed on the line while she packed and snuck out, only hanging up after I heard the door to her apartment close. When years later our father died, she called and begged me to come home immediately. I was in the car within an hour. But now my sister is so angry she's broken all contact with me. And the reason is this. I named our father as a child molester. Years earlier, maybe 20 years ago, I told my sisters each in turn that my father had abused me when I was 6. I remembered the experience with painful clarity, but the shame and the isolation that followed was in many ways as bad as the abuse itself. And while I prayed that nothing had happened to my sisters, I had to find out, for my sake, for theirs. They told me each in turn that nothing had happened to them. They also made it clear they didn't want to hear about my experience or talk about it ever again. I took their answers at face value, and I took their silence at face value. They hadn't been molested. They didn't want to talk about me being molested. I accepted that. Since I'd always suspected that I was the only one who'd been abused, I wasn't surprised. I was mostly just relieved. Relieved that nothing had happened to them. Relieved they hadn't told my mother. And relieved that my revelation hadn't caused a huge family rupture. Another person might have been more skeptical. Another person might have read their silence as an expression of denial. Another person might have realized that under that mannerly silence was something darker. I wasn't that person. I was the person who was willing to accept silence in lieu of the rejection I was bracing for. I did notice that my sisters treated me a bit warily after that. Debbie seemed dodgy whenever I called, eager to get off the phone. She was by then deeply involved in caring for our aging father. When I visited, she seemed to make a point of showing me how well she understood him, even though Alzheimer's had rendered his speech almost indecipherable. Meanwhile, she played roughly with him, tipping him back in his wheelchair, making a joke about popping wheelies. The first gesture struck me as possessive, the other as hostile. Amy seemed to avoid me at family gatherings, but she'd always kept a certain distance. Liz, the one closest in age to me, acted almost afraid of me. And yet she hung in there, calling me at least once a week as she had before. And to her credit, the 2 of us preserved a genuine closeness that we've developed as adults. She and I maintain a kind of DMZ, which only became dangerous if I trespassed into conversations about our childhood. For the next dozen or so years, there was a kind of peace until our father died. The night before the funeral, I saw that my name had been removed from the list of speakers in funeral program. Somehow between the day of his death, when I drove to Pennsylvania to be with Debbie, and the day of the wake, it had been decided I wouldn't be speaking. No one had told me, but somewhere along the line, my sisters must have blackballed me. Did they really think that after keeping my father's secret for 4 decades, that I'd announce it from the pulpit at his funeral? I guess they did. And all at once, I was once again the little girl alone with the shame and isolation of childhood sexual abuse. I was, even in my very adult black dress and heels, once again the child that my father had used, then set aside. I became wordless. I staggered through the wake that evening, unable to put sentences together. I don't remember much from those days, but when my mothers and sisters and I went back to my parents' home afterward, I ate a lot of candy, apparently. Debbie teased me about it. The next day I sat in the pew numb, listening to her give a eulogy, and I ate a big slice of cake, apparently, at the luncheon after the Mass. Debbie, who'd gotten heavy in the past few years, teased me again. "What are you worried about?" I said, my muteness suddenly gone, my tongue now a loaded weapon, that I won't fit into my size 2 dress, unlike you. My mother's daughter, I knew exactly what to say to wound her. None of us spoke for quite some time after the funeral, but eventually a new truce ensued. A year or so after our father's death, when Debbie adopted her son, an adorable 4-year-old boy from Haiti, all hostilities ceased. I loved him at first sight. When he, unable to speak English, indicated he wanted to go swimming at the pool where I was staying, I jumped in fully clothed just to make him laugh. Gradually, he decided he would get in too, clinging to my neck the whole time. Over the next 10 years, he and I became buddies. Our annual trip to the mall to buy Christmas presents for him to give Debbie was the highlight of my holiday. Debbie would give us a list: slippers, electronics, clothes from her favorite store, and we would make some of our own choices: a heart-shaped pendant, a Notre Dame blanket, a box of chocolate-covered cherries. As I think of that Notre Dame blanket now, I'm reminded of how like my father she is. She's an accountant like he was, proud of all things Irish as he was. She's a personalized license plate as he did. She loves cars and football and corny jokes. She did pro bono work for Catholic organizations just as he did. He was her hero. And as the youngest, as my buddy old pal, she loved me the way a baby sister loves a big sister. She held my hand until she was 12. She sent me homemade cookies in college. She brought me chocolate-covered cherries with her babysitting money. With the blindness of an oldest child, I see now that I was her hero too. As I sit here in the comfort of my sunny office, years away from that mall, I look again at the image of the assassin that my sister posted on Facebook, and I think I understand what happened. When I told her about our father, I killed off something precious to her. I not only assassinated his character, I assassinated the image of the father she thought she knew. I also broke the bond between the two of us. As her buddy old pal, I was supposed to be the one who took care of her, not the one who hurt her. In my need to address the harm I'd suffered, I'd caused harm, to her especially. And I realize only now that all those years since I'd told her about the abuse, she may have been torn between her love for her father and her love for me. Perhaps she became wordless too. Maybe she staggered through the next 2 years, unable to reconcile the two irreconcilable versions of our father. Perhaps she was rendered numb by the impossible wish to remain neutral as one of her loved ones sullied the other. So when I criticized her for screwing up the Christmas trip, it was her turn to become the loaded weapon. She pulled up outside the department store, dropped her son off, and sped away. He delivered a message to me. Mom says not to buy her anything this year, he said, not quite able to look me in the eye. She says she'll just throw it in the trash, like she does every year. I don't think that last bit was true. I'd bought her things she'd asked for, some of them expensive. I had a feeling she was just being mean. Rather, she was showing me she was willing to use her son to be mean. I looked at him, this kid who brought us together, being torn apart. I said, okay, we wouldn't shop for Debbie, but we'd buy some things for him. After we paid for his clothes, we walked to the designated pickup place. We were tight on time, but we went past the store that sold the chocolate-covered cherries. I dragged him inside. A box of candy would be a peace offering, I decided. I reached across the passenger seat of Debbie's car as my nephew got in and handed my sister the candy, but she threw at my head as she drove off, the car door still ajar. I stumbled around the parking lot, too shaken to drive, unable to take in what had happened. I finally called my best childhood friend. She made a joke about the two of us going back to fish the box of chocolates out of the gutter. Then she came to pick me up. The next day, my sister posted the picture of the assassin. Since then, I've come to think that when a family secret is revealed, it's like an underground nuclear detonation. There's no mushroom cloud, no visible fallout, but there is a blast zone, concentric rings of damage. In an atomic explosion, the rock closest to the blast is vaporized almost instantly. Farther out, the substrata is cracked, or in physics terms, irreversibly strained. With a family secret, those closest to the truth suffer shame. Those further out, denial. The nuclear unit is irreversibly strained. The shockwaves reverberate for years. The half-life, it seems, infinite. And while I may be ground zero in this scenario, all of us are collateral damage. Even my nephew now is in the fallout zone. That's because childhood sexual abuse is a weapon of mass destruction. While the harm to the victim is obvious, all of us, my sisters, my mother, even my father, carry trauma as a result of what happened to us. They may not see it, but they too were harmed. It's a war that keeps claiming casualties, causing victims to take up arms against each other. Once again, I find myself looking at the image of the assassin my sister posted. We are both assassins, I decide. She and I, with a special capacity for hurting each other. And while at first I thought Facebook was an oddly public and distant way for her to convey her anger, I get it now. It's safer to send a message from the far end of the fiber optic cable. It's safer on my end of that cable too, I realize, as I type these words and send them into the ether. Thank you. Ed?
Nicely done, Patty. You're here.
You know, what I was thinking this afternoon is that both of our pieces are about generational trauma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what I liked about yours, especially, was that you chose to write a story of defiance, not of victimhood, that it was time for a story that showed the courageous, life-affirming actions of the victim. I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm sort of rocked by listening to you read it, because I had read your story before, but it's quite another experience to hear it in your voice. And I, you know, I'm still sort of resonating with that. I think I'm very interested in family myths, and I'm interested in you know, how we create them and then how they serve us at different times. And I think what's interesting is that you are talking in that story about what it was to you then, but then reckoning with what it is to you now. And I think that actually had something to do with my own as well, because I think I had, you know, looked at aspects of my past and distant past with different eyes, depending on it. And even, by the way, as I read that little bit about the St. Gaudens Memorial statue, how history itself has usages, and it has relevance that's contemporaneous to the moment that it's made, and a different moment, and so too does history and film goes back and forth in the way that we can describe how the Vietnam War was described in one movie and then another, or even by the same artist differently. And that's what interested me about listening to you talk about the different phases at which you're encountering it.
And as I said to you in my email, I felt as though when you talked about making it about the now, that those uncles were the godfathers of the fighters in Mariupol. That it's a very
right. Well,
piece.
You had said that, and it struck me, by the way. What struck me too is, how this man Zelensky, who, when you go back and see how he was characterized for a long period of time, he was characterized comically. And yet our appetite to find someone who was emblematic of heroism in a time where there seemed so few of them, how we've all attached to that. Everyone is putting, flags on their cars and on their Twitter feeds, and that somehow that's given us something that we so desperately need, is some evidence and some, anecdote of real heroism.
Yeah, we want it so badly.
Yeah.
We need it so much. And I think that I also want to thank Roger again for this space, because it makes it possible for us to kind of elevate those ideas and talk about things like our very human desire to have heroes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, particularly when what's happened in my world is that that authenticity has been sacrificed for the sake of a kind of, pumped up comic book sense of what it is. There's when I even look back to the films that I saw as a child and that I looked toward, some of them were obviously, done in this kind of vibrato antime, this melodramatic shape, but there were others that were really based in truth. And I think we're all hard pressed, certainly in film these days, to find that what is actually celebrated, if it's not going to be fabricated heroism, is nihilism, is a kind of really outre, amoral behavior that seems to be the wellspring of so much storytelling now. And that's discouraging, actually. I think it's part of the same syndrome that we're talking about.
Yeah, when you talk about the DC Comics style heroes, it's kind of unrelated, but it made me think of a hero that I encountered this morning, a librarian from, I think she's from Fredericksburg, Maryland, where they're banning books. And she called to tell me, or she wrote to me to tell me that they're reading excerpts of one of my books get banned all the time, but they're reading excerpts of a rape scene to portray it as pornography so that the kids can't read it. Okay, well, it's one thing for me from the safety of my home to say, kids need those books, and, they don't get to see themselves and their experiences represented in books if those books are censored. But it's another thing for the woman who lives there, who is employed by that school district, who goes shopping with the people that are posting these horrible comments about her online. So, there's heroes, and it's really scary times that we're in.
It's funny that I thought also about Malala.
Yeah.
And I thought, when I was actually sitting there reading about Glory, that we both took it upon ourselves. It's not revisionist history, but it's about trying to redress a certain kind of history. that character became an iconic figure because you chose to try to give voice to someone who didn't have a voice, or a group of people who didn't have a voice. And I think that's somewhere was also behind my motivation too. In a couple of the stories, when I made a film about child soldiers in Africa called Blood Diamond.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm motivated by much of that same impulse, is to say, what can I do to amplify something that might not be heard?
How is it possible that we've both done work about child soldiers? That's uncanny.
Yeah, I would say I don't think Roger chose that as part of our pairing, but that's true. He did, didn't he?
But back to Malala, she says, when I met her, I talked about the death threats that she was still receiving. And she said, well, they can kill me, but they can't kill my message.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that speaks to art as well.
Mm-hmm.
That the things that you've made, the things that I've written, we hope are going to last in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That even if the individuals aren't around anymore, or the people who are the characters who are portrayed in your stories and in mine aren't here, their messages and their actions are alive.
Yeah, I mean, we do what we can with what we have. I mean, I don't think either of us are presumptuous enough to think that a single thing can do anything or change anything. But if you believe that things aggregate, if you believe that it can become a kind of rising chorus that grows and grows until it reaches a tipping point, I think that then you have a sense of purpose and a belief in some kind of activist or programmatic agenda in addition to the art, or as part of the art that you're doing. I think about same-sex marriage, and I think about the images that were broadcast into all of our homes that just grew and grew and grew. And I think that had as much to do with a consciousness shift, a paradigm shift, as did any number of marches or lobbying by political organizations.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with that. And then there's also the argument to be made that it reaches that one viewer or that one reader who really needed that story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh.
Hello.
Hi, Alice.
You all were real fighters getting on tonight. Thank you so much for me. I can't imagine you not reading that incredible piece.
Yeah.
The two of you, it's just been magical. And I do want to ask a couple of the questions that our audience has posted. And some of it may have to do with some of the questions Ed and I were talking about in the green room about, and he touched on it just now with Glory and with I Am Malala. I had never heard of either. I'd never heard of the Massachusetts 54th. I'd never heard of Malala, obviously. And you clearly brought into focus a history that had been ignored or unknown. What kind of different touch might you have taken with and Ed, I think some of your writing actually touched on this when you talked in your book about Glory specifically, or your writing, excuse me. How different was that for you when you realized that you're representing something to a population that needs to be represented? Well, yeah, go ahead, because I'm asking it very.
I mean, I had hesitation and some I was wary based on certain experiences of the politics of the late 1960s and 70s about being a young white filmmaker, presuming to do that. I didn't think that it was going to be a kind of cultural appropriation, but nonetheless, what was remarkable to me was the generosity and embrace that these people had in the enterprise, and that I realized very quickly that they were in some rapture. They were hearing things that they were hearing music that I could only vaguely make out, and yet it was very clear to them. And so the process of doing it on my part, and I suspect on Patty's too, was very much a giving over. It was very much about humbling myself and trying to allow these voices to rise up. And I learned a very important lesson, even as a director, that sometimes the best direction you can do is just get the hell out of the way, and let a story tell itself. And I suspect that it was true with you too, Patty.
Yeah, and for me to admit what I don't know and to just say, tell me what I don't get here.
Right.
That I couldn't possibly, I haven't had your experience. I will say, though, in my field now, it is very difficult for writers to write about experiences that are not their own. That the kinds of books that I used to do, which were really full of reporting in different countries, right now that isn't open to me.
Yeah, I do ask myself 30 years after the fact, if I were to set out to try to do this now, would I be able to, in any number of ways, would I be able to do it economically, culturally, politically? All of those questions can't help but be raised.
Well, one of the questions that was brought up by the audience, and I'm going to actually hybrid it with another one, that talks about the things that we learned from the nonfiction that you've presented us and the things that we've been enlightened by. I felt like our culture was moving forward. And then we had the former guy. And I will not name names. And then you had 4 years of opening a Pandora's box that seemed to set back a lot of our former lessons. Do you feel that way? Or do you actually feel that we're starting to stand on those shoulders again? Do you get what my question is? Is it a little bit too obtuse?
No.
I can take a stab at it if you need.
Go.
Please.
I just think the battle line has moved, and it's in those small towns. It's at those school board meetings. It's in the classrooms. I don't see progress.
I mean, what I worry about too is the chilling effect. Is that there's an assumption that things are going to go south, and therefore a writer or a filmmaker or someone will just not be willing to sally forth into it, and you're getting your ass handed to you. And so you have any number of subjects that suddenly become taboo and aren't treated by anybody.
That's an interesting part of our culture that I'd not thought of, because I think Patty was talking about book banning in libraries and so forth, and that's my universe. I understand that. It will comfort you to know that people have been walking in the door purposely and go, sell me anything banned.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, because there's so much of my store that, there's so much that has been banned, and even in our local community years ago, but not much. I live in the liberal Northeast, but I don't think, does it cross over into the film industry that way, or is it mostly showing up with what they're not producing?
Yeah, I think it's more subtle, but it's very complex, because so much of it is based on real good intention. The idea of representation and the impulse toward better and more broad representation is the best thing. But when that becomes a kind of exclusionary thing unto itself, it's having this kind of unintended consequence. And I think that it's so thorny to try to dig into, because I know that, for instance, this is just for instance, I've worked with a group called Global Witness, which is talking about it's been about the resource curse and the exploitation of the resources of the third world. And I've been very interested in trying to write a piece about the murder of environmental activists in Central America, which is a huge issue right now. And I know that as I began to try to think of how to frame a story of that sort, that I felt suddenly this vaguely censorious impulse about saying, well, do I go there? Will I encounter any kind of woke, reverse Stalinist, injunction to address this subject, because it's not my world.
Hmm.
So what I'm saying is that I felt it too before the fact, even.
I think that's the chilling effect is the big question. The books that don't get written, the films that don't get made, and then if it does somehow clear all the gatekeepers and get published, in the case of a book, the librarian who says, I better not buy that, I better not stock that in my library.
I have a very good friend of mine who just called me. She's a wonderful photographer who's done a lot of photographs in the third world, portraits, and she was about to have a show at the University of Nebraska, I believe. And some of those portraits were of young girls, and it was about the abuse of young girls. That was one of its subjects, and there were a couple of nudes in there, or actually just bare-breasted women, because that was how they chose to be photographed. And this show had been all over the United States, 40 different places. And she was called literally last week by the curator of the museum, saying some of their donors, she was afraid of what their donors would say. Therefore, could she remove those pictures from her show, the purpose of which were to demonstrate that exploitation? That's the places you're talking about, Patty. It's not happening necessarily at the Met, but it's happening at the University of Nebraska.
Yep, that's the case with my book. It's about trafficking.
Right.
That rape scene that was read.
Right.
And yet, don't you find a wider audience now that people are actually looking for? People are there's a population that is banning it, but another population that is resisting that and looking for it to be able to support it. And so I find a little hope in that. And I think it's just going to take generations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can die happy that I was in the same headline as Toni Morrison, because the rape scene in one of her books was read at the same time as mine was, and we prevailed, Toni and I.
That's pretty good.
Awesome. Folks, I hate to say this, but we need to wind it down, and I'm so sorry to do that. I ask one question at the end of every episode, and this is not homework, but I just want to ask because I am a bookstore. What are you reading now? What's on your book? What's on your nightstand? What book are you reading? Or Ed, are you just reading scripts?
No. A couple of books. I mean, I read books, maybe not of this year, but of the last couple of years. I read Patrick Radden Keith's Say Nothing, which I was really engrossed in. And I read a book by Kurt Anderson called Evil Geniuses, which is a narrative history of the fleecing of America by the collaboration of government and Wall Street. They were two pretty amazing books. Thank you, Patty. What are you reading?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say that I just finished reading, although I loved every sentence of The Warmth of Other Suns. Embarrassed only that it's been out for quite a long time. And Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead.
Both great books. All four of those books that you've mentioned are great books. So thank you for sharing that with me. And I am going to sign off now. And I do want to give you my eternal gratitude for this evening. It's just been enlightening and wonderful and exceptional. Thank you, Edward and Patricia, for participating in Right America this evening, and to every one of you who tuned in tonight. And thank you for your patience while we worked out our technological problems. And thank you mostly to Roger Rosenblatt for creating this original and important series to look forward to each and every Monday night. Tonight's episode is the perfect example of the purpose and mission of Right America. We hope to see you all at our next episode. We're going to skip a week because of Memorial Day and be back on June 6th at 7 p.m. as we welcome Susan Cole, Wyatt Prunty, and Alia Trabuco Zeron. Please remember to check out Bird's Book's Write America page, where you can sign up for upcoming episodes and maybe purchase a book or two. Thank you all for joining us this evening.